Hello and welcome to INSPIRE's Unplugged Dialogue series. INSPIRE is a Horizon Europe project that started in October 2022 and will finish at the end of September 2026. The aim of INSPIRE is to create the European Centre of Excellence on inclusive gender equality in research and innovation. And INSPIRE really has two main goals. Firstly, to build up the evidence base on how to integrate an intersectional perspective into gender equality plans, and also to provide practical support to 12 communities of practice of approximately 90 organizations working together to design, implement, and evaluate an inclusive change process. And I would like to welcome today's guest, Professor Pat O'Connor, to the Unplugged Dialogue series. So, Pat, for those listeners who are not familiar with your work, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Certainly. Thank you very much for inviting me. Well, I suppose I should start off by saying I spent 46 years in higher education, 3 in institutions in Ireland, 2 in the UK. Over that 46 years, I never had a woman boss. Well, that will have certainly changed in the meantime. But the first 12 years of that 46 years, I was on contracts. That has not changed, I suspect. I suppose the thing that is perhaps most intriguing about me is that I became an overnight success after approximately 30 years, right? I think this is a very good trick. I'm joking, of course. I suppose I started off really interested in women's worlds, women's lives in the home, women's lives at work, women's friendships. I did my PhD on women's close relationships. And then there was a point, I suppose, at which I started to get interested in how those worlds were viewed and in the gap between women's experiences and the versions of what their experiences should be as dictated by power holders, by institutions, etc. For about the past 25 years, I've been interested in women in higher education and the whole gendered character of higher education institutions. I've written a lot, right? At the start of my career, first 10 years I wrote almost nothing, paralyzed by perfectionism, etc., the usual things that I think many women experience. And then I decided that if I didn't write, by the time I was 40, I would have to give up the dream of being an academic, a proper academic. And that so terrified me because I had no other ideas as to what I wanted to do with my life. So I started publishing and I've kept going since. Mostly all but the last thing I've published what I call academic stuff, right? Roughly 8 books, oh my God, 80 referee journal articles, 30 chapters, etc., etc. And my most recent book publication, which was published in the past year, is a proper, inverted commas, woman, question mark, one woman's story of success and failure in academia. And that's really trying to save other people what I call 15 years, right? Basically, because I think I woke up to the realities of power very late. So I suppose I thought, well, if other women could save themselves 15 years, right? This would mean they would get where I got, they'd get there quicker. And so that was the motivation. I became a full professor, the first full professor in my institution and the first professor of sociology in Ireland. I also was appointed by 4 presidents to be dean and was dean for 10 years, although I had never had any aspirations to be in management. I found being a professor daunting. The shoes of the professor to me were very big. The shoes of the dean to me were very small, and I had no worries about being dean, but I had major worries about being a professor because I felt, you really have to know stuff. Well, mostly if you even Google professors, even yet they're overwhelmingly men.
Of course, you had already a very long career, and
Yes.
I'm curious, what kind of changes have you observed throughout your career in terms of women's career paths and, I don't know, leadership positions in academia? And when we had our talk before this recording, we talked a lot about how critical you are in a good sense, in a sense of being a critical voice in this field, to also talk about how there is still so much more space to grow. We also talked about how we could measure these changes in terms of gender equality or gender equity in academia. So could you share some of your thoughts on this, and maybe also examples from your own experience or your own work that would illustrate this progress, but also the limits of this progress?
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, things have changed at one level a great deal. So, for example, in 1997, when I became a full professor, I was the first in my institution. Within 15 years in that institution, the University of Limerick, 32% of those at professoriate level were women. Now, it wasn't, the University of Limerick was not exceptional in the sense that the overall proportion of women in the 1990s was extremely low in Ireland, as it was across the EU, right? And so the gender profile of the professoriate has changed. Now, paradoxically, it has changed more in Ireland than in the EU. So currently, 32% of those at professoriate level, and I mean full professor level, okay? I'm not talking about, the American system, etc. And whereas in the EU, it's roughly 26%. So this has been a huge change. The second thing, which is even more dramatic, is that since the oldest university in Ireland is Trinity College Dublin, and since Trinity was founded in the 16th century, it's a public university, there was up to 2020 no woman president stroke rector. There was no woman in that position in any public university in Ireland until 2020. Between 2020 and 2023, women obviously changed their biology or something. I'm being ironic, because 7 of the 12 universities over a 2.5-year period, 7 of the 12 universities had women as rectors stroke presidents. 58%, from 0 to 58% over 2.5 years. Now, this miracle, inverted commas, has not happened in the EU, where it's roughly a quarter of heads of universities, rectors stroke presidents. The names differ, of course, but roughly a quarter are women. So in many ways, Ireland is seen as, good heavens, exceptional, as extraordinary, as having certainly changed the whole gender profile of women in senior positions. Now, the actual composition of the governing boards in universities have also changed to be gender balanced. So now, at one level, Ireland is a great success story, but how deep does this change go? We know that, for example, there's been a survey of gender-based violence, sexual harassment and gender-based violence, microaggressions, and it shows that roughly half of the staff felt condescended to, diminished, right? And the women were twice as likely as men to feel this way, and particularly women in arts, humanities, social science, business and law. We know that roughly a third of the students who answered the survey, I should say, had actually experienced rape in their institutions. So clearly, many things are still not, as I would see it, right. We also have much more subtle things in terms of the trivialization and the devaluing of areas where academics are predominantly employed. But of course, the question then arises, like, how is it that because mostly getting change in the gender profile of the professoriate, most countries, is extremely difficult, right? And we have seen in Ireland, for example, from 2013-14 to 2024, the percentage has increased. Now, in most of the pre-2019 universities, which are the only ones who have full professors at the minute, but the percentage has increased really so that most of them now, there's 7, most of those 7 are in the 30%, and even Trinity is 38% of those at full professor level are women. And Trinity, which is the oldest, most prestigious, very well known, in 2004, 10 years before, there was a very much smaller proportion of those at full professor level were women. In Trinity at that time, it has gone from 19% to 38% over a 10-year period. But interestingly, one university, Galway, which helped to create the momentum for change through the Micheline Sheehy-Skeffington case, it was 12% in the basically, and it has now increased, but still low, the lowest in Ireland, 27%. So the question, how is it that this change has happened? And I suppose, like, I'd want to say the beginnings of this change go back 30 years. But on the other hand, there was, in the past 10 years, there was a series of things happened that helped to bring about this huge change. Like the case of the Micheline Sheehy-Skeffington, it was a case was brought by a member of Galway, and she was found to have been discriminated against. The case was 2008. It was only decided 2014, but that was this huge impact in terms of triggering the Higher Education Authority to looking at gender equality in all of the institutions in Ireland. And they set up an expert group, of which I was one of the members, and that produced a report. And since 2016, almost every year, the state has done something to promote, to develop gender equality. So that was going on at the level of the state. There was EU pressure, both in terms of research and in terms of, in 3 of the 7 universities, there were EU-funded projects, basically fomenting, raising issues. There was agitation at staff level, so that it was a multi-layered, at the individual, at the organizational, and at the national and international level. There was multi-agency layering going on, influences, pushing, raising issues, etc. So in a way, it seems that it can look really simple, you know. Athena Swan was introduced during that period. The state did a load. So why did it happen? Multifactorial, multi-level, but certainly in terms of the gender profile of senior positions, Ireland is totally different to what it was. Now, obviously, Irish society was also changing a great deal during that period. So the higher education institutions have been very slow in all sorts of ways and very resistant to change. But I mean, Ireland was the first country to have a referendum on same-sex marriage. Do you know what I mean? So even though Ireland, in many ways, it's a very small society and it was coming from a very patriarchal base, but it's a small society, you know, and the referenda, several referenda on all sorts of things. But the key, for example, the same-sex one, it was won on the, basically by saying to people, you know, how would you feel if your daughter or your son, you know, was gay and wanted to marry? And so it was this kind of, there is a personal element to a small society. It's only a population of 5 million. So change, yes, I suppose change, it's really important to say change has happened. Change is possible, particularly on what would be regarded as, you know, the profile. But how deep does that change go? That is the question.
I find it very interesting what you mentioned about how on the professoriate level, there is this big change, but then on, let's say, an institutional culture level, we might not see that kind of transformation. And of course, that's also a bit maybe more difficult to see. Like you mentioned that you do these reports, so I guess surveying women in these institutions, but what is, let's say, the difference between these very visible changes of professors or leadership roles taken up by women and then these more invisible transformations that would need to happen? What would be maybe a way to transform these institutions on that level as well?
Well, I suppose it's important to say that the higher education authorities' view as to what is important in creating this transformation is Athena Swan. Athena Swan is, it was originally a British, it would be seen as a quote quality mark, although that would be disputed currently, which it was, when it was initiated, it was about encouraging institutions to recognize the efforts of women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. It is now extended to all staff, all genders, all institutions. Ireland has really bought into Athena Swan, right, in the sense that there's a huge number of awards. Partly that has been initially because for example, the Higher Education Authority expert report in 2016 recommended that all the major funding agencies made getting an Athena Swan award within a specific period of time. They recommended that that would be linked to research funding. The research institutions bought into that, and so obviously, there was fierce pressure within institutions to get award. And initially a bronze award, it's bronze, silver, and gold. Currently, there are no gold holders in Ireland, institutional award holders, but there are 4 silver. Now, what I'm working on at the minute, I'm still at academic stuff, right? And I'm looking at the successful silver Athena Swan award applications, 2 of them, okay? One older, one younger university. And to be honest, the idea that Athena Swan is the driving force for tackling gender inequality is not supported by the content, the analysis of the content of these successful silver award-winning applications. In fact, gender washing would be nearer the mark. So in a way, like these applications do create an awareness of gender. The champions tend to be positive, but actually changing the culture, even in these plans are 2022 to 23 to 4 years to 2026-27. So they're not the first plans, okay, because they've obviously got the bronze award before. But the level of even recognition of the problem of gender inequality is not there. The assumption is gender inequality is sorted. There's a focus on success. There is a failure to move beyond individual solutions, basically fix the women, right? Okay. Training in really a failure for the organization to take responsibility for the culture, the structures, etc. There's a lack of ambition, even where the data shows, for example, that in different faculties, different things are happening. An obvious thing to do would be to look at where is best practice and see, can we emulate that? Not rocket science, but in fact, even where their own data shows that some faculties are doing well and some faculties are not, they resort to basically saying, fix the women, increase the proportion of women applying, etc., etc. So in a way, the possibility, the hope, like actually one of the principles of Athena Swan is it is aiming for structural and cultural change. I'm not asking it to do any more than Athena Swan is asking of itself. And I'm afraid looking at these successful silver applications, this is not the way to transform the culture. It's a way to get people to talk and the acceptability of talking about it. But there's been an excellent piece of work done by a Flemish scholar, Roos et al., who has shown that just getting people to talk about things doesn't change anything. You have to say who is going to do what by when. Otherwise, you have the comforting feeling that it's all sorted and nothing has happened. Business is that the feeling is, well, gender inequality is sorted. We now need to move on to intersectionality. But in fact, intersectionality has not been tackled either in these successful Silver Award winning applications. So what we do know is, both in Ireland and elsewhere, it is mostly the people who are actually doing the work on the applications are junior women, whose careers are being basically sacrificed in the interests of trying to move this agenda forward. And for example, Monica Malone has done some work and has talked about the happy talk by the senior people in senior management, who are predominantly but not exclusively men. And basically, like, their view is that really Athena Swan is being used as in kind of what has been called peacocking, showing how great their institution is, rubber stamping. So that kind of transformation at the organizational culture level is not happening. And yet Ireland is feeling there's a certain cozy feeling that really it's all grand here. Well, I'm sorry, I don't think so. So yes, there have been achievements. Yes, they've speeded up in all sorts of surprising ways. Yes, it is possible to get change in what other countries would regard as intractable areas, like the professorships and the rectors, but at lots of fundamental levels, in terms of both informal microaggressions, but also in terms of the fact that, like, these Athena Swan applications are produced by the structures. They're 180 to 200 pages long. They are an institutional product, and they are extremely disappointing.
Thank you very much, Pat, for all these insights that you shared with us today. And for our listeners, please come back to the next episode of Unplugged Dialogues, where we're gonna continue this conversation with Pat O'Connor and talk more about the solutions on how can we create more sustainable and lasting changes in institutions for an equitable research and science community.